Good afternoon, everybody. I'll turn this over to Lynn Whitfield, our coordinator for today's voting rights session.
Somebody's saying, wait, be patient. If they knew how long it would. The battle lines are drawn and once again, somebody's saying, wait, be patient. If they knew how long it would be before all people could truly hear freedom ring. I wonder which end of that moral arc would they choose. I wonder if more would have walked in his shoes. This is what revolution looks like. You gotta get in and then stay in this fight. You've got to find a way to get in the way. Speak out every day. Freedom riders or let.
Go ahead.
All righty. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the second semester. I can't believe it, Daryl. We're talking about the second semester, the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute 2022.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, Barbara. And, 2021 was just such an exciting semester of learning. 2022, boy, we're picking up where we sort of left off, and there's so much information that we want to share with all of our folks that are listening to this session. And Barbara, this is really an exciting time, right? Because as we speak and have this session here today, we're celebrating our first Black woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court of the United States. Our hearts are going out to the folks that are over in the Ukraine and what's happening there. There's a lot happening across the world, and there's a lot happening in our country. There was reason to celebrate, there's reason to be concerned, but most of all, Barbara, there's a reason to vote.
Amen. I'm frozen.
Carol, I think Barbara is frozen.
Yeah, I am frozen.
Okay. And, one of the things we wanted to do with this second semester, beginning of the second semester of the Voting Rights Institute, is not simply to talk about our current victories. And when we speak of the Supreme Court nominee being a first Black woman, African-American woman, to be nominated to the Supreme Court, and I'm confident that they'll be able to get her through the process. But that's one of the major victories that we're celebrating today. But there's a string of victories that we, as African Americans in particular, have celebrated over decades that go back to post-Civil War. And that's a lot of what we wanted to lift up today, was a lot of those victories that were there, and understanding how those victories tie. You always hear me talk about put it all together, make it connect. How does that tie into where we are today as we prepare for the future? And Barbara, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, I'm sorry, everyone. I hope my settings continues to be better. But I just wanted everyone to know, Daryl said it all. The nomination of Ketanji Jackson is what we've been waiting for, what we fought for, what Harriet dreamed of, what Sojourner dreamed of, what Fannie Lou knew was possible, what Frederick, told us would come if we kept our demands coming, and fought. And what Reverend Jackson has always told us, that you can't win if you don't fight. Well, what a great time for us to be living. What a great time for us to be doing our justice fight. Ooh, but are we in a time of fight? But today we want to talk about some of our great accomplishments, because we wouldn't be standing here. We wouldn't be able to have this session were it not for the many great sacrifices and accomplishments of our ancestors. So we're going to start off talking about all the good fighting that's been done in the past, all the many struggles and accomplishments. And then we're going to talk about what we got to do now, because it comes to us in this moment. There's nobody else living to do this work but us. And it's all about our creativity, our passion for justice, and our smartness in getting this done well. So with that said, let's go.
Daryl looks like she froze again.
No, I have a blank screen.
Can you see it, Daryl?
I
I can
can't
see the screen.
I don't see a screen.
You see the slide, Daryl?
There is no slide.
I just see the acknowledging the victories of the past, preparing for the
Right, that's
future.
the first slide.
Oh, okay. So it's me again.
But Daryl, I'm gonna move to the first slide.
Okay, so during the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War lasted, really, we say that that post-Civil War era really continued on from 1865 to 1877. Part of the reason that that is said is because we know that, you know, from like Douglas Blackman and his book, that after the Civil War ended, there was still a slavery sort of a leasing type session that went on that continued to have Blacks that were put into servitude, that were put in everything but slavery. They would have them arrested and then leased out to work in mines, to work in all types of really dangerous type positions. And they would continue to push them forward in those fields and you know, pay them small stipends for the work that they were doing. And that really was slavery by another name. And it was just a continuation of what had happened prior to the ending of slavery. And Barbara, I see that you're back.
Hallelujah. Whoa. Can everybody hear me?
You have it.
Yeah, you're on double.
Can't hear you.
How's that?
Much better.
Okay, my apologies, and I'll take care of it during the next break. So during the Reconstruction era, Errol has already talked about the challenges that African Americans faced as, quote, freed men, and how, you know, every impulse in the political and economic sector of the US was to re-enslave African Americans. And these freed men, however, having fought during the war, having done all the accomplishments that they had made, were not for a minute willing to be left behind. And so what happened during that period was that the African American freedmen took their 15th Amendment rights to heart, and they spent a considerable amount of energy in making sure that they had representation in the political sector, in the electoral sector. So what we saw was, amazingly, in a short 12-year span, African Americans took over political offices throughout the South. 600 were elected to state legislatures. You heard me what I said. I said elected, not appointed. 16 became congressmen, 2 served in the Senate, and 14 in the House. And when I say 2 served in the Senate, let me point out that it wasn't as if all of this African-American progress was not opposed, because one of those 2 barely ever saw the chambers of the Congress because of all the internal fighting to keep him from assuming office. Next slide, please. But we would not stop. And we started, we established our equal rights leagues, we had meetings, we had parades, we did petitions, and more importantly, we did massive public education. I remind people that the entire existence of what we call the United States public school system came out of the demand by free people for school and education. There would be no public education system in the US but for the incredible advocacy of freed people. We also, by the way, formed a lot of powerful labor union leagues with poor whites during that time. And so there's a lot of history here that is not well told, and especially the history of the formation of the African-American women clubs during this time out of the churches and as social leagues. Next slide. Daryl?
And Barbara, one of the interesting things that happened out of the South is that you had this heavy concentration of now freed slaves, of freed enslaved people, free Black people that were now voting. And so one of the things that they did, particularly in Mississippi in 1870, was that they elected the first U.S. Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels to the U.S. Senate. Interestingly, you immediately saw the pushback. You saw that white America was not ready for it. The white Southern Americans didn't want it, and they pushed back. And in pushing back, they then began the argument indicating that Senator Revels wasn't qualified because he had not been a citizen for 9 years. And as a result of that pushback, Senator Revels only ended up serving a little over 1 year of his US Senate term. Next slide, Lynn. The first African-American senator to actually serve a full term was Blanche Bruce, who also was out of Mississippi. And he served that full term. And it was very interesting because at that point, you continue to see the power that is being picked up of the vote, and that free Blacks are now voting, and they're exercising that political control. They're getting the concept of voting down and political power and what they can do. And that's a lot of what comes out of the Blanche Bruce election as the US Senator out of Mississippi. The next slide, please, Lynn. Barbara, the redemption period.
Yes, the redemption period is really amazing. You see, the slide that's missing that we should have told you is that everything called Reconstruction ends in 1877, or it comes to a grinding halt after what is called the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. The Hayes-Tilden Compromise is the election where there's a fight as to who won because the Electoral College vote collapses and is almost even. And as a result, there's a compromise that is entered into whereby Hayes is allowed to assume the presidency, but on the compromise of all the Union troops being pulled out of the South. Now, this entire period of African-American political exercise and political dominance and political fulfillment is based on Union troops protecting their right to vote, protecting the polling sites, protecting the voters. And when the Union troops are pulled out, the Klan takes over, other kinds of, quote, panty rollers and all kinds of other vicious forces come to bear in destroying what is called the Black vote. So during this, quote, redemption period, where allegedly the South is renewing its engagement as part of the federal government, as part of the Union, is actually a period where it's once again a deception period, where the name does not reflect what's happening, because it's a destruction period, where all the gains of the electoral gains during that period are being destroyed. And let me be clear, and I say destroyed, I mean destroyed, where Black voters are being killed as they try to vote, where Black people's homes are being bombed and burned to the ground, where Black legislators and white Republican legislators, radical, quote, Republican legislators are being murdered. I mean, this is a serious period of denial. It's only able to be accomplished through incredible violence. So the redemption period is actually the period of the destruction of Reconstruction. Moving on.
And you know, Barbara, the Hayes-Tillman Compromise, many would say it is better called, not that redemption period, but it's better called the Black betrayal period, because
Yes.
it really was where the federal government betrayed
Yes.
the free Black people that were in the South. And that's really what leads us into this slide in dealing with George Henry White, the first Black congressman out of North Carolina, Barbara.
Yes, and you know what else, Daryl, that people don't understand is that during the period of Reconstruction, a huge percentage of the Union Army that was occupying those southern states to protect Black free people, they were African Americans. And that hatred to this day of Blacks with guns goes back to that period in particular, where Southerners and throughout, you know, other parts of the country, where there's just this resentment of Black men with guns enforcing the law. And when those Black men had to put their guns down and had to leave the Union Army, there were just story after story after stories of Blacks being lynched, Blacks being hounded for wearing their Union uniforms even. So this is so important. Now, George Henry Wright is the culmination of the end of Reconstruction. He is in 1901, the last remaining African American serving in Congress. And he tells a tale of voter suppression as he is getting ready to leave Congress, because in his farewell address to Congress, he tells the horrible story of the voter suppression that's being used against Blacks throughout the South. And he talks about all of it, everything from reducing polling sites, closing polling sites, lying to people, not giving them the right ballots, taking people off the ballots. He tells the stories of people being terrorized and scared and and haunted as they're trying to vote. He tells all of these stories so powerfully. And he calls for the South, he calls upon Congress to do its job of protecting the Black voters. And he says, I may be the last in my time. But he says someday, but let me say, Phoenix like the Negro will rise up someday and come again. His speech appeared to be prophetic, because a few decades later, there would be Blacks elected from other parts of the country to office. But think about this, everybody. It wouldn't be until 1965 that the next Black would be elected from the South. It wouldn't be until 1992, 91 years later, that the next Black would be elected from North Carolina to Congress. So let's understand the power of voter suppression. Darryl,
and Barbara, one of the things I find most interesting with regards to George White is this, right? Is that people need to understand was when he wasn't reelected, it wasn't because he wasn't elected by the people. He decided not to run for reelection. And the other thing with George White, Barbara, was that as you know, he introduced the anti-lynching bill in 1900. Furthering what you were just saying, he introduced anti-lynching legislation. And what I find really fascinating is that, of course, he was a Republican because that's what Blacks were at that point, is that the Republican National Committee rejected the anti-lynching as part of its platform, rejected protecting Black voters as part of its platform. All of that led to the reason that George White would not run for re-election. But even more interesting, Barbara, because you're a North Carolina girl by way of some of your background, and the whole revolution that we heard about, the whole uprising that we hear about from 1898 with the Wilmington race riot in North Carolina was predicated upon the re-election of Congressman White. So it was really interesting to start digging in and getting a lot of this information for what it stood for. And I'm going to leave it on this point. The other thing that I found truly interesting when it comes to George White was this, Barbara, was that we know that part of the process that was being used to try to disallow Blacks from becoming elected officials and acquiring power is that they went to where? To the local voters, to the local election boards. And the local election boards were miscounting votes so that they could get rid of some of these Black elected officials, and they were undercounting votes. So it's just an interesting, fascinating piece that was there. And of course, as you were, I'm sorry, Barbara, I cut you off.
Yeah, I was going to say he didn't run from office, everybody, not because he didn't want to serve, but because he knew that he couldn't win because they had suppressed his voters so bad, which is what he talks about in his speech, and that he wouldn't, that they wouldn't be able to turn out and vote in peace and in freedom and equally like they were entitled to. And indeed, he would leave North Carolina and would go to Pennsylvania and farm what is now still called Whiteville. And I just wanted to, add that piece of history. And the Wilmington 1898 massacre is that. It was a massacre. It was, they were so angry that African Americans had taken over the government that they literally burned and killed every member, as many of members of the government as they could find, and then reinstall white power viciously, brutally, and the US government did nothing about it, neither did the state.
And interestingly, what we see happening around that point is the slide that we have now, because you're seeing this power and this wealth that's beginning to emerge in the Black community. And as a result of that, these Black massacres start happening so that the white community can try to take back that political power and the political and the economic power and take it away from the growing African-American community that was coming around at that point. So you had Black massacres. It wasn't limited to the South. So it wasn't just the Opelousas and the New Orleans and the St. Barnabas parishes that were going on, or the Rosewoods in Florida, or a limitation to Wilmington, but you had it in Memphis and Tulsa. You had it in East St. Louis. You had it in Chicago. Across the country, all over that part of the country, you had all kinds of Black massacres that were coming forward. And a large part of it was what Barbara was saying earlier, is one of the ways that was trying to be used, that was successfully being used to suppress Blacks from voting, to stop them from going to the ballots, to keep them out of political power, to keep them away from the political structure, to put fear in them so they didn't even want to try to exercise that right to vote. Next slide, Glenn.
And may I ask you, can you see me?
Yes.
You can see me because I can't tell when I'm being seen. Okay.
Yeah. No, you're full view.
Okay.
Full view.
Thank you.
So just 28 years after George White's farewell speech, after he had predicted the phoenix and the return of the Black elected official and the Black community, the state of Illinois elected Oscar Stanton DePriest as to a member of Congress. He took office in 29 and left in 1934. But Barbara, I've got to tell this one little piece though. The first Black to be elected post-Reconstruction to Congress happened to be someone who I considered a friend, someone for whom we do a big dinner for here in Maryland. It was actually Perrin J. Mitchell in 1972. Next slide, please, Lynn.
Yes, and you know, and everybody knows that there's this really odd period where African Americans change our political allegiance from being Republicans to being Democrats. And it is an interesting transitional period. You may recall that in the first period of our teaching, that we talked about that entire period from 1900 to 1930, where you had political betrayal of Blacks, especially by President Woodrow Wilson. And we talked about how you know, Blacks felt, you know, abandoned by their Republican Party, and how we start having, you know, changes. And here is, of course, Representative Arthur Words Mitchell being elected from Illinois as the first Black Democrat to Congress. Moving on.
And then in the 40s, it's part of that phoenix that George White spoke about, Barbara, because now you're starting to see more Blacks elected to Congress, and you're seeing more Blacks participating in the voting process. They're acquiring, they're honing in on the political skill, honing in on the economic strength. And so you have Representative Bill Dawson out of Illinois that's elected from 43 to 71, as well as the great Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. out of New York from 1945 to 71 as well. And boy, I can still hear many of the speeches of Adam Clayton Powell. And you know, if you were to sit down and read any of his books, King of the Cats, or any of the books with regards to Adam Clayton Powell, you learn so much about that experience and what he went through. And he was part of what we call the civil rights movement from the 60s as well. Next slide, please.
Now, well, one thing I want to say about Adam Clayton Powell's real quick, because Diggs will continue this tradition and so will others. He becomes a voice for Black power. It's not just that he was elected, but he brings in a perspective that is not being voiced politically about Black political power, and talking about Black self-determination and Black leadership. He is a different kind of voice. And Congressman Diggs will continue that tradition, that he will also join in, bringing that great, you know, voice, speaking about, you know, Black leadership, Black determination. He will be a different force. And then you will have, you know, Robert Dix, a senior in Pennsylvania. So you're seeing the states being broadened where this representation is coming from. Illinois, New York, you know, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Moving on next. And let me be clear before we get into this slide. All of what we just saw, all of those Congress people, by the time we get to 1965, even with all of that progress, there's only 6 of them in Congress in 1965. So nowhere close to the 16 during Reconstruction. And it's very telling that there are no Black senators, right, during this period. And what is so important for people to understand is that every bit of progress that you saw, every Black person that was elected during those early years of the Phoenix return, those African Americans were elected because Blacks took their political power seriously and used it and really exulted in it in the states where they could. But throughout the South, we know that in Alabama, only 5% of African Americans who were entitled to vote were registered, were allowed to register. And there are so many horrible stories about how Blacks were repressed in North Carolina, in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Florida, in Texas, and Alabama, and all throughout the South, Louisiana, you name it, Tennessee, Kentucky. All of these states went out of their way to suppress African American voters by not allowing them to vote. In fact, Rosa Parks' story is exemplary, that Rosa Parks, before you knew her for sitting down on the bus, Rosa Parks actually, was not only a woman's advocate, fighting against rape of Black women, but she also was an incredible voting rights advocate. She went to vote, register to vote, and they told her when she came to register that she would have to come back the next day because she had come too late. She came back the next day, made sure she was early. She took the exam, which was a literacy exam. She passed it, I mean, with flying colors, no period missing, no comma missing. She did an absolutely incredible job of writing the first part of the entirety of the US Constitution. And they were appalled and told her, well, they had run out of time. She had to come back again tomorrow and do the same thing because they had run out of time. She showed up again. In fact, she would show up 5 days in a row until they finally realized she was going to keep on coming, keep on passing that literacy exam with superb qualifications. And they gave up, and they gave her her card, her voting rights, her voting registration card. But that is the example of what they were doing to Black people throughout the South to keep them from voting. And that's why people were yelling that we had to have a Voting Rights Act to hold these states accountable, to enforce a federal law, that there had to be the right to vote. So the first thing in this fight for the right to vote, let's be very clear, it didn't start in nobody's 1965. There were efforts to have various forms of voting rights legislation going almost every single year. Blacks were meeting and demanding the right to vote in all kinds of conventions, the NAACP, all kinds of groups. Remember, the NAACP is formed in 1905. There's all these efforts, by Blacks to have voting rights legislation passed. And in 1964, we get the poll tax legislation. In 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And if you look at that Civil Rights Act, you will realize that the first couple of provisions of it tried to address voting. But it was so just tepid. It was just a joke because it gave no real voting rights to anybody and no real law enforcement. So everybody was fighting for a Voting Rights Act. And remember the famous story of Darrell. What happened when Martin Luther King met with President Lyndon B. Johnson and said, President Johnson, we got the 64 Civil Rights Act, and now we need a Voting Rights Act. We need you to take the leadership in getting that done. What did he say to King?
Oh yeah, Barbara, Lyndon Baines Johnson, without missing a beat, said, I agree with you. We do need a Voting Rights Act. Now go out there and make me do it.
That's right.
And make me do it.
Make me do it.
And that's just an incredible part. But Barbara, one of the other things that you had touched on that I want to be certain that folks get, a very good friend of mine had the opportunity to interview Rosa Parks and to hear Rosa Parks in a conversation. And one of the most interesting things that Rosa Parks said was this. She said that, people always ask her, and she asked them, what was it that she wouldn't give up? And everyone always says, well, it was your seat. You wouldn't give up your seat. And Ms. Parks would correct them. And she would say, it wasn't my seat I wouldn't give up. it was my dignity that I
Right.
would not give up. And that's what people have to remember, is to put all of this in the proper narrative when we're going through these phases. And as you speak about the phoenixing of the Black vote that George White has spoke of previously, again brings us back to Adam Clayton Powell. If people have not had the opportunity, and I ask you to please Google in Adam Clayton Powell, the speech, "What's in Your Hand?" Because in that speech, he goes and he's speaking to a Black community, and he's telling them, a poor Black community, and he's telling them that what's in your hand is a ballot and the power to elect people that represent your interests. And that's the message that was being sent out throughout the 60s, throughout Adam Clayton Powell period, throughout this whole Phoenix. You even have Malcolm X, Barbara, advocating that people use the power of the ballot. It's what? The ballot or the what? The bullet. Advocating the power of the ballot. All of that is what's coming together and culminating at this piece in time. And that's what's happening as we go into this intensification of the fight for voting rights. Next slide, Lynn.
And Daryl, yes, next slide. And Daryl, I do want people to understand that, it's almost wrong for us to skip over so much, but let me just really fill in a few more gaps before we get to this slide, because let's understand, there's no Selma without the Montgomery boycott. There's no 64 Civil Rights Act without the Montgomery boycott. There's no Montgomery boycott without what? Without the Rosa Parks, but there's no Rosa Parks without Emmett Till. Let's go to Emmett Till, because Emmett Till changes the entirety of Black consciousness in America. That's what people got to understand. It wasn't just that he was killed and people were upset or people were saddened and people were depressed. It was that it changed Black consciousness. Black people would never think the same again. After what happened to Emmett Till, and Rosa Parks said that her awakening as an activist happened because of Emmett Till, that's what made her finally decide, after years of people saying, Rosa, please sit down on that bus because you're the right person. Remember, they didn't, when Claudette Colvin sat down, nobody rallied around her, but they would not rally around, but they kept saying, Rosa, we need you, we need you, we need you. And it was Emmett Till's death that transformed her, that transformed so many people. So I don't want that to get lost. That's how you end up with a SNCC. That's how you end up with an Ella Baker. That's how you end up with an entire new movement, and that you don't have a Selma without having SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And because of Ella Baker's amazing leadership, her friendship and her partnership with the mighty Fannie Lou Hamer and all of them. I mean, I just don't want this to get lost. It's Amelia Boyton standing on that, leading all the advocacy in the South, and people forgetting that the Boytons had power in Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama, because her son is the Boyton in the U.S. versus Boyton. It's Boyton versus Virginia case. I mean, people forget that there was just all of these, connections that make, Black consciousness. It's the way we think starts changing, starts transforming. That's what makes us unstoppable, right? And determined. And because of all of that, because of the sacrifice in Selma on March 7th of 1965, because of the beating of John Lewis, because of the beating of the 600 who were bold enough to walk across that bridge and saw those troops and still kept, those state troopers and still kept moving. It's because of them that we actually end up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed, which will transform voting and political power for African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans and Native Americans throughout the United States. Next slide.
And you're right, Barbara, and it's after the passing of that Voting Rights Act of '65, which I don't think it could have been said any better. I say that perhaps the child of the voting rights movement, the civil rights movement, was the August 28, 1955 killing of Emmett Till. But what begins to continue with that phoenix and that growth and that and the victories is after the passage of '65, we then have Mayor Hatcher out of Gary, Indiana, who gets elected. We have Carl Stokes, who was elected mayor in Cleveland, Ohio, both of which were civil rights activists in their own rights, and certainly groundbreaking elections for both of them. Next slide.
And once again, we keep on seeing more and more Blacks coming to Congress also, not only mayors, but now we're seeing the Blacks coming to Congress with really strong voices. You got William Lacey Clay coming out of Missouri. Then you got the incredible Shirley Chisholm, who would blow people's minds because not only would she be the first Black woman elected to Congress, but she would use her voice and she would say things that we're still talking about, that if there's not a chair for you at the table, bring your own chair. And then we take it farther now. We say, hey, we create as Black women our own table. Oh, she told us a whole lot. And then we had Louis Stokes coming out of Ohio, more states being represented here. Again, next slide.
And then it culminates, Barbara,
yes,
in Boston, Massachusetts in '67, where we then have our first post-Reconstruction elected Black U.S. Senator, who is Republican, and then by the name of Edward Brooke, who gets elected out of the state of Massachusetts. And it's interesting to note that still at this time, you're having all the struggle going on in the Deep South with the suppression of the Black vote and all that's going on, but Massachusetts elects Edward Brooke as the first first Black U.S. Senator post-Reconstruction. Next slide.
And people need to understand that that was a different era. That's when you had liberal, I'm serious, liberal Republicans, and you had, and he came out of the liberal wing of the Republican Party, and people need to understand that he was just so incredibly important, and that because of him, it helped to make that moderate to liberal wing of the party, so powerful. Republican Party. It's nothing like what we deal with now with these, hard far right people. So the number and then redistricting kept happening, and we saw, the number of African Americans increased from 19 to 13 in Congress. Then we saw, the forming of the what was now called Congressional Black Caucus is formed. We see, with 13 founding members, some amazing people like Ron Dellums and others. And now there are, because of all of that work of our ancestors, our parents, our people, the sacrifices over those years, we currently have over 60 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Next slide. And this is just a listing of the founding members. And when you read that list, like Perrin Mitchell, Daryl, you see some of the absolute, what I would call giants: John Conyers, Ron Dellums, Diggs, Augustus Hawkins, Rangel, Stokes, Fauntroy, and of course the mighty Shirley Chisholm, so many others. Moving to the next slide, please. Daryl, you want to take that one?
Sure. So, the first Blacks elected to the post-Reconstruction from the original 11 Confederate states. And, Barbara Jordan, how how much can you possibly say about Barbara Jordan and Andrew Young? Just, you're seeing that rise, that the strength that's coming out of the South. Got to remember that the South still has the most populated Black population in the country, and they're still trying to assimilate that strength to elected officials. And so you have Barbara Jordan coming out of Texas and Andrew Young coming out of Georgia. And, Andrew Young obviously would just go on to do just phenomenal things. Next slide.
And can we say one thing about this era? Those people that we were listing out of Congress, and Andrew Young is a great example. A lot of these are your civil rights leaders, the people who were engaged in the civil rights battles, who fought for the Voting Rights Act, who made the changes. These are who's being elected to office. So they're bringing a voice of Black consciousness again, Black power, and they are pushing for Congress and the United States to give further equality to African Americans as part of their positions of being elected to Congress. Moving on. Oh, yes. Black women. We've had to fight. We have in our previous classes last year, we talked about the entirety of the fight for the right to vote for African-American women, and why we don't, get all excited about the 19th Amendment's anniversaries, because African-American women were denied that right to vote. And then, of course, and we were talking about that Reconstruction era, those were African-American men, because it was only men who were voting in that entire period. But Black women being elected to the Senate was something we hadn't seen, just like we haven't seen a Black woman governor to this date. There's a whole lot of things that we still, a lot of, accomplishments that and barriers that we still have to take down and kick the doors open. But Carol Moseley Braun, I remember her election in 1993, and this came on the heels of what, everybody? Come on, the Clarence Thomas nomination. It comes on the heels of the confirmation battle and people's disgust with the Senate for its all-male representation and the insensitivity that was shown to Anita Hill. And remember that Anita Hill is kind of abandoned by Black people to a large degree, by people who want to quote Black on the Supreme Court. So they abandon the sister's claim and saying that she's just a crab in the barrel. And 2 years later, all the political sentiments change, and people say, well, Anita must have been right, when they watch how Clarence actually performs on the court, and they realize that they were hoodwinked. And that's why we say all, skin folks aren't kin folks. And so all of that leads to a whole tidal wave of election of women to the Senate. And Carol Moseley Braun is the Black woman who benefits in that moment. Moving on, and she proves to be a great voice in the Senate. Moving on. And then here we go, there. Here we go. Oh yeah, the victories continue, because why, folks? It's not because we're sitting on our hands. It's because we're fighting. Because we're fighting to get our political power, and people are beginning to fight us back. So it's no accident that we are able to have a Senator Barack Obama elected not only to the Illinois as an Illinois congressperson from Illinois, but also to become president soon thereafter. And Daryl, what do you want to say about this moment? Because this is one of the big moments.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Barbara. That this is one of the defining moments in American history. And it really challenges not just white America, but it challenged Black America too, because it raised the question for many African Americans whether or not they believed that an African American could be elected president of the United States. And during that period, there were a lot of folks, a lot of African American people that were not supporting Senator Obama, because they did not think that he would be elected president, and they went off on other tangents. But victory draws great friends. And once he came through the primary election and was the nominee, let me tell you, the African-American community, in my estimation, as well as liberal white community and young folks, came out of the woodwork to support soon-to-be President Barack Obama. And that's just a phenomenal moment in American history, Barbara.
Yes, and then to everyone's surprise, we had, President. We had a really ugly backlash, of course, of voter suppression, because in 2009 you start getting these voter ID laws in response to Barack Obama's election. You start seeing a rise in 2010 during the midterm, because 25 million people who voted for Barack Obama in 2008 set out the midterm election. And as a consequence, 33 states become, really taken over by the GOP, which then decides that voter suppression is their future, and starts, and I create the map of shame in 2011 to try to tell people this story, and folks don't want to listen. 2012, we fight voter suppression tooth and nail, and we are able to reelect Barack Obama. But then in 2016, voter suppression takes over, and people aren't pleased with the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. Some of the sexism is at play, but in any regards, we end up with the Trump administration. And then after its amazing failure in 2020, people turn out and vote like crazy, and they do something radical. They elect the first woman as vice president. Let me be clear. There had been women candidates for vice president in the United States on different tickets before. Remember, not only for the Republicans, you had Sarah Palin. You also had, other women who had been nominated in Democratic Democratic tickets. But it is Kamala Harris out of California to become the first not only Black woman senator, but to be elected vice president in 2020, a seminal moment in history for African Americans, for women, for Asians, just an amazing accomplishment. And she has been, a voice, as you saw yesterday, as she stood where? On the other side of Kentucky, looking proud because she helped to make that happen. Moving on to the next slide. Daryl. We wouldn't be talking about this without TJC's work in Georgia, without the work of the mighty Helen Butler and the Georgia People's Agenda. We wouldn't be talking about this without all of the work that Stacey Abrams and so many others did, making Georgia. But this election, this Senate runoff saved the Congress. It saved the Senate. Daryl, you want to talk about that some?
You're absolutely right, Barbara. For the first time in Georgia's history, they elected a Black person to be the U.S. Senator out of the state of Georgia, as well as their first Jewish person to represent the state of Georgia in the U.S. Senate. And as Barbara was saying, Black Voters Matter with Latasha Brown and Albright and all the other organizations that were there on the ground during the middle of COVID, after having encountered some really vigorous voter suppression that was going on throughout the state of Georgia to keep Blacks from voting, to keep brown folks from voting, to keep people of color from voting, to keep young people from voting. They were able to get the votes out. And for the first time in Georgia's history, they did elect both a Black and a Jewish to the U.S. Senate. And it was just a remarkable outcome. And the question now will become, can they continue that streak as we speak? Senator Raphael Warnock is up for re-election because the seat that he was filling was a continuation of a term, and so he's up for re-election for this next election cycle. So it's going to be a fight, Barbara, but I know everybody's going to be back on the ground pushing to get all the voters out once again to be certain that that voters make it to the ballot. But what it kicked off, it put on steroids, voter suppression, because following that election that brought Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff into office, there was some vicious voter suppression that then came out. It came out on steroids. Saying you can't give food and water to people online, saying all kinds of, making it very hard for people to vote absentee ballot, a lot of stuff, trying to take control of who counts the ballots and how they're certified, and the Georgia General Assembly stepping in the place of some of the local election boards. All of this came about from the 2020, and now for this election that's coming up, it's going to be tested for the first time. Barbara?
Absolutely. So we just want to remind everyone that, we fought like heck to, pass the Freedom to Vote Act. We fought for the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act. And we made it to the floor of the Senate. And sadly, it was not passed. Next slide, please. And that our struggles for now on is to fight for for voting rights in 2022. We're going to need everyone to continue this education, because it was public education that won 2020. People get it all confused, and people think that it was only the only thing that happened that made it possible in 2020 for people to vote was turnout. But that turnout happened because we did the work, and that we taught people how to vote absentee, that we taught people how to vote safely during COVID. So we want you to know that there are things like this call to action says that you can do, directly, that you can be the advocates that we have to be to make 2022 a reality. Next slide, please. John Lewis, don't ever forget that we got to get into good trouble, that we got to make some real good trouble in 2022. And we are going to be not only doing these incredible Voting Rights Institute programs, for which we are so grateful to Lynn Whitfield for doing all this great work, for preparing these PowerPoints and everything else. But we will also be holding seminars, doing other work, and we want you to meet us in Selma. We're going to be in Selma for the Jubilee. Yes, Bloody Sunday was not just history, it is a call to action for the continuation of this battle for voting rights. And Transformative Justice Coalition will be in Selma. We have 3 big workshops that we're doing, 2 on the 4th of March and 1 on the 5th of March. And then on the 7th, we will be stepping out the first day of the march from Selma to Montgomery, and we will march every day from the 7th through the 11th and be part of that 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery. And we will be having workshops and town halls and all kinds of events every day. The TJC will be part of some of those, and we hope that you will come and be part of Selma. Watch, because TJC, through our Facebook page, we will be live streaming quite a lot of events. Go ahead, Darryl.
And Barbara, I want to close it out with this. Our whole thing right now is talking about fighting, recognizing the victories of the past and claiming the victories of the future. And I cannot think of a better way to close this out than another quote from Congressman George White, where he said, in the face of it all, that we have done it in the face of lynching. We have progress, burning at the stake, humiliation of Jim Crow, disenfranchisement of the male citizen, slander and degradation of our women, he would say. Factories closed against us, Negroes not permitted to be conductors on railroad cars. We still rose. He would go on, Barbara, and say the Negro not permitted to engineer the locomotive. not permitted to, backed by the labor unions working against the Negro. The Negro still rose up. He would end by saying, you used our labor for 2.5 centuries and then taunt us about poverty. But let me remind you, we will not always remain poor. You may withhold even the knowledge of how to read God's word and then taunt us for our ignorance. But we would remind you that there's plenty of room at the top and we are climbing. And that's what we're continuing to do right now, is to climb. We invite you to join us out there, continue on this climb, continue on our next victories, Barbara, because more victories are to come and the struggle will continue.
Amen. And I want people to know that you're central to this fight. Don't ever think that you're just a person. You are a person of power, a person of knowledge. Help us to share knowledge. We hope to see you in Selma. We hope that you will join our workshops. We look forward to our upcoming institute sessions, and we look forward to bringing you unshared knowledge. Because the one thing I tell people everything, if there's nothing you do, go read George White's farewell address to Congress. Read it in its entirety. It's not long, but it's brilliant. And know our history. That's why they're trying to stop the teaching of critical race theory, of teaching Black history, teaching women's history, teaching LGBTQIA rights, passing the Anti-Woke Act in crazy Florida. That's why they're doing all these evil deeds. And that's why we'll be talking about how do we create a better movement. We'll be talking about in Selma how to be the best advocates possible. You want to be there. You want to participate. You also want to be part of this institute. Thank you again, Daryl, for the honor and the privilege of working with you. Thank you again, Lynn, for all the good work. Thanks to all our participants for being with us. Thank God for all this great work. You probably have seen the daily Black History calendar that we've been doing every day. We are serious about public education. We are serious about our history. We, as Daryl says, we got to know our history because there's no other way that we can stand strong and claim the victories of the future. Thank you so much.
Okay, Barbara and Daryl, we have one question about whether or not you think the federal voting rights legislation will come to the floor again before midterms.
I think there will be some form of legislation introduced to address many of the matters that were contained within the bill, within what became the last bill, the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act. I think you will see some elements of that. I just want people to not be tricked and fooled by some of these bad, lousy bills that are being proposed. You will see what we support and you will know that those are the strong and good bills, right, Daryl?
Right, and the Electoral Count Act is the one that Barbara is speaking of. Don't be fooled with that Electoral Count Act bill that they're trying to say that's doing something, because all that does is says, after we've suppressed your vote, now we can count and see how well we were in suppressing those votes with the electoral count. The other piece that we want to add on to there, wherever you are in this country, be certain that to understand that you can take pieces of the Freedom to Vote Act into your state legislature. That's where we need to move it, is into the state legislatures. Sometimes, as Lyndon Baines Johnson said to Dr. King, make them do it. And if we get the states moving, we can make the federal government move. So let's make this next step, taking it off the sidewalks and into the street, make it into the streets of every state capital to get the federal, the Freedom to Vote Act elements passed into those state legislatures.
And we'll be talking about how you do that when we're in Selma. That's why we want you to join us for those workshops. They have a new bill they just introduced for the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act in New York. It's moving in New Mexico. It's being introduced in other states. Let's do this, people. This is who we are. We are the people who say, when they say it's impossible, we say, just watch us. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us today for the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute. We will not be holding the Institute next Saturday. because we will be in Selma. And so we are encouraging you instead to watch the live streams of the workshops that will be done. But we will be with you the next week. So thank you. Look out for the schedule that will be coming out and the topics that will be discussed. And with that, class is dismissed. Please share this. It will be posted on YouTube shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. We're done.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so
All right,
sorry
thank
about
you.
I'm so sorry about the technical problems. I have no clue why all that happened, but in any event, thank God for alternatives.